the microphone's working fine? Okay, is there a clock here? That's fine. My cell phone right here, so I watch my time. Good, excellent. So there's going to be a few different perspectives, and I'm going to go through that quickly. I think under definitions, though, we're quite similar. Euthanasia is directly and intentionally causing the death of a person for the purpose of relieving suffering. It'd be different from other forms of homicide in the sense that we're talking about relieving suffering. Euthanasia is direct and intentional, so it's not accidental, it's not unintentional, it's intentional. Usually done by lethal injection. It's a type of homicide in Canada. That's how it's dealt with at the moment. It only differs from common homicide in its intention to relieve suffering, and it's often referred to as mercy killing. So what is euthanasia not? And this is where we might disagree, because we're talking, Udo talked about the issue of withdrawing treatment. Clearly it's not about withholding or withdrawing medical treatment, especially that which is futile, burdensome, extraordinary. But medical treatment itself, it's not about withdrawing medical treatment. When you withdraw medical treatment and someone were to die, they don't always die obviously, the end result is a natural death. It's not about an intentional death. It's not a direct and intentional death. The proper use of large doses of painkilling drugs to reduce suffering is not euthanasia. Some people make that comparison and they say, well, we do this all the time already. Clearly it's not euthanasia. The proper use of sedating a person with a regimen of drugs to relieve the suffering of a person is not euthanasia. Now, when I'm talking about the proper use of large doses of painkilling drugs or the proper use of sedation, I say that because obviously these things could be abused, and I think the previous speaker mentioned about how these things sort of go on already, and there is a fact that there is abuse of that. The proper use is very unlikely to cause anyone's death. We may have a different view on some things. Certainly, when we're talking about assisted suicide, a lot of people like to call that aid in dying. I think that's a euphemism, and the reason I say that's a euphemism, or assisted death, is a euphemism in a sense because palliative care can be seen as aid in dying. Aiding someone who is dying, not actually causing their death, but they're aiding them. Assisted suicide, though, I think our definition is the same as when one person is directly and intentionally involved with the causing of death. The person does it to themselves, right? The law says we're not allowed to aid, encourage, or counsel suicide, is what the law actually says. That doesn't mean that suicide itself is illegal. It says, oh, I'm not allowed to assist a suicide, right? So suicide is not a criminal act, but assisting. So my involvement in it or your involvement in it is a criminal act, yes. So I say we need to be clear about what this is, because one of the arguments you're going to hear, and you've heard it already, is that it's really morally identical to, say, removing a life-sustaining treatment and euthanasia, suicide. These are morally equivalent. Jocelyn Downey made that very clear in her book. Jocelyn Downey, you know very well, you may not know well, but she's certainly a Canadian ethicist, the chair for law and ethics in Canada, very well respected. She says there's no difference between killing and letting die, and I say this is a modern fallacy. One of these points right off the bat is, if you believe there is no difference between killing and letting die, then in fact we're doing this all the time already. And I would say there's a clear difference between killing somebody and letting them die. There's a clear difference in the intention, and there's a clear difference in the outcome. So let me explain this further. The intention to allow someone to die is to allow a natural death to occur. No one's actually causing death. We're removing treatment. But does the person always die? The answer is no. Give me a lethal dose. What are you intending? You're intending to cause my death. Do I die? Yes. Okay. Do I always die if you withdraw treatment? No. Is the intention the same? No. They're clearly different acts. And the law recognizes them as different acts. The Supreme Court of the United States recognizes them as different acts. And I think that comparing them is a fallacy. The Quebec government is talking about, they're proposing to define euthanasia as a form of medical treatment. Now the reason for that, I think, is because healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction and the criminal code is a federal jurisdiction. So if euthanasia becomes a form of medical treatment, then it becomes a provincial issue rather than a federal issue. They're also talking about establishing prosecution guidelines which would allow euthanasia to occur without free or fear of prosecution. I think that's pretty accurate. The Carter decision, now this case is being appealed, but this was a decision dealing with the primary litigant actually was Gloria Taylor. The reason it's the Carter case is the original family involved in the case were the Carter family. The assisted suicide law was declared by Justice Lynn Smith as being unconstitutional. She said it because it denied people with disabilities equality under the law. I think that's a loaded point, but she also said that we need to legalize a limited form of euthanasia because we need to allow people who are unable to die by assisted suicide to have equality. The federal government she gave till June 15th to legalize that was dropped by the courts though, and Gloria Taylor had a constitutional exemption to die by euthanasia assisted suicide. So I think that's where we're at right now, and that's being appealed, and that case will be, the appeal is being heard next week. That'll probably end up at the Supreme Court of Canada. The LeBlanc case was in Quebec, and that was very similar. Jeanette LeBlanc has died. I think I spelled Jeanette wrong, actually. Jeanette LeBlanc has died, and she died of natural cause. The case was dropped. Gloria Taylor also died of natural causes, and there's the Rizzulli case that's being dealt with also, which is also somewhat similar but not the same as these cases. So this is the landscape. The Royal Society of Canada, which was the other speaker was the chair of, they've been involved. They put out a report. The Quebec Government Select Committee on Dying with Dignity put out a report, a major report. There was the Commission on Assisted Dying in the UK. There's a decision by Justice Lynn Smith. What they all have in common is they all say that euthanasia or assisted suicide should be legalized. They all say that in jurisdictions where it's legal, there's no adverse effects on vulnerable groups. They say there's no proof that a slippery slope has or will occur. And I think that's what is being said. So I think we have to look at these studies. I think we have to examine whether those presuppositions are correct. Because if those suppositions are wrong, then we have a different debate on our hands. The other thing is, just so you know, in Belgium and the Netherlands, the characteristics of patients whose death was the result of euthanasia, now this is when it's reported, they tend to be a younger patient, 80% of the time they've had cancer, and they tend to die at home. That's in Belgium and the Netherlands. That's and it's more often men than women, but it's somewhat similar. So I'm going to look at this first study in Belgium, and I think it's quite an important study. This was a population-based survey. So what this study did is it looked at 6,927 deaths in the Flanders region of Belgium. And it sent out a questionnaire to the doctors who were directly connected to that person's care, who were the doctor involved in that death. They had 3,623 acceptable responses. So that means they had more. They actually had more than that, but some of them did not give them the data they needed in order to come up with any proper conclusions from them. 3,623 responses with effective data. From that information, you find there's 208 assisted deaths, and they said 66 of them were done without explicit request. That's a 32% number. Now, the previous speaker referred to the number of deaths without request as being somewhere in the range of 2.7%, and that had actually gone down since legalization. Well, the fact of it is the number of assisted deaths have gone way up since legalization. And the other thing is, even though the law specifies that it must be by request, you still have a large number of deaths that are without request, a very large number. And I think it's important because the argument that legalization will then prevent deaths without request, or deaths that are outside the law, in fact, I think is very wrong, that in fact that does continue, and it continues in fairly large numbers. And just after the legalization of euthanasia in the Netherlands, the 2005 annual report expressed that there had been 950 deaths without request in the Netherlands in that year, and the more recent one has reduced it to about 310. So in fact, that number's come down significantly. To argue, though, that there's fewer deaths without request now that it's legal, the difficulty is that we have to actually look if those studies are showing apples to apples or apples to oranges. And I argue that, in fact, there's not a complete comparison, because before legalization, the definition of assisted death was wider than after legalization, because we're talking about a specific type of a death without request. It becomes more specific. Who were those people who died without explicit request? Well, the study showed that 70.1% of them were comatose, and 21.1% were had dementia. So we're talking about those 66 deaths of that survey, right? And it shows then that 91.2% were incompetent, right? They were either comatose or had dementia. And you have to look also at the reasons. And there's quite a few reasons, but some of them that jumped out, which are important to me, is that 17% of the time the physician thought it was in the best interest of the patient to do this without request. Now that might be because the person actually had a very bad prognosis. That could be very well the truth. And 8.2% of the time the physician thought the discussion would have been harmful. these are just interesting facts to throw out to me. The other thing is nurses were more often involved in the administration of the drugs when the euthanasia death was without explicit request. Now what's important here also when we look at the study, now the reason I mentioned nurses is because the law specifically only allows doctors in Belgium to do it. So the fact that nurses are doing it means it's another case of something outside of the law, and it's important to point out. It's important also to look at, some would argue, but these aren't always the same, because a lot of those deaths without explicit request are done by a massive dose of morphine rather than muscle relaxant barbiturate, right? They're done in another way. So the question is are they not intended to be a euthanasia death? And in fact, a large number of them weren't intended that way, to be seen that way. The question, though, of the survey was very interesting. The question was, did you intend death? Right? Did you intend death, and did death result? And the answer in those cases was yes. If you did not intend death, meaning you were using a large dose of morphine without intending death, then it would be in a different category. Okay? So the use of life-ending drugs without an explicit patient request often involve patients with diseases other than cancer, which have an unpredictable end-of-life trajectory. So it was important that it was a different group of people. These people tended to be 80 years or older, who were mostly in coma or had dementia, and the study said they fit the description of a vulnerable patient group at risk of life ending without request. So you can interpret that any way you want, but that's how the study represented it. They said this does fit the description of vulnerable patient group at risk of life ending without request. What's important is that in many of these studies, outside of these sort of studies that are saying that in fact there isn't a vulnerable patient group that has a risk of life ending without request. And this study would say the opposite. Justice Smith actually dealt with this in her judgment. So in this judgment it says, finally I note that Professor Deline, who was one of the researchers who was cross-examined for the decision, was asked about the comments in the study, population study, that the use of life-ending drugs without an explicit patient request occurred predominantly in hospital and among patients 80 years or older who are mostly in coma or had dementia and fits the description of vulnerable patient groups at risk of life-ending request. Okay, so she's dealing with it. So this is how she responds to that further. She says, his response to this line of questioning suggested that possibly he did not wish to admit that he had said that patients who are 80 years or older are vulnerable and at risk of Lauer. Now what's interesting about that is, I wasn't actually privy to that piece of video, so that'd be interesting to see. But nonetheless, she's questioning whether or not he actually admitted to say that. But it doesn't really matter whether he admitted to say it or not. He did say it, and on top of the study says it. I take into account that Professor Delines was ill and was being cross-examined by a video link in English. This is right in her decision, not his first language. Perhaps for those reasons, or perhaps because of a lack of impartiality, his response in this area did not seem wholly straightforward. My response to Justice Smith is, excuse me, but you can look at the data yourself. You don't have to even ask him any questions. The data was before her, and the data suggests that this is true, and the study said that this was true. So whether or not it is true, you can argue it till you go blue in the face. The data says it is. The role of nurses is another interesting study that came out. Now this is a different set of data again. There were questionnaires sent to 1,678 nurses in Belgium. 1,265 responses were completed correctly, meaning they had more than 1,265 responses, but they only had effective data in 1,265 of those responses. 248 nurses reported that the last patient in their care had died by euthanasia. Now almost half, which is 45% in this case, reported that the last patient in their care died by euthanasia without explicit request. Now that's significant, but I would say actually that 45% might not be a completely accurate number. The reason is let's look at the two studies. So I'm being very straight. The first study looked at an individual death, right? And a questionnaire was sent to the doctor about that death, and they came up with a response that 32% of euthanasia deaths were without request. That's a fairly accurate way of doing a study. This is more dealing with nurses. It's possible that you would have two nurses who had experienced one patient. It's possible that the numbers might not be quite 45%. I acknowledge that. But what I'm saying is it's still significant. It's a massive number. Right? It cannot be ignored. 14 of the cases, the nurses admitted to injecting the patient. So once again, that's clearly illegal. And in fact, in 2 of the cases, the nurses said that they did so without actually talking to the doctor about it, which would be not only really illegal, that'd be really, really illegal. Okay? People who died by euthanasia without request, the study said, were more likely to be over the age of 80, die in a hospital, and were less likely to have had cancer. Once again, the same demographic group as the other studies said. And then the study went out to say something like this. It seems that the current law, which does not allow nurses to administer life-ending drugs and a control system, do not prevent nurses from administering life-ending drugs. Yes, 5 minutes. Perfect. Excellent. So we're going to look at the next. This next study uses the same data as the previous study. So we're looking at the 3,623 deaths where we had strong questionnaires. And it suggests that 52.8% of those deaths, assisted deaths, were reported, and 47.2% were not reported. So this is a very interesting look at the data. What were the reasons? Well, 76.7% of the time, the doctors did not believe it was a euthanasia death, so it was not necessary to report it. So that would make you think that, in fact, the numbers don't actually represent the full, true situation. But, you know, the researchers dealt with that question. If you look at the study, they actually deal with it, and they say, the law does not define how you do euthanasia. It does not define that you do it by muscle relaxant barbiturate. It defines that you were intending to cause death, and you did cause death. Right? That's what defines it. So therefore, the fact that a lot of doctors didn't believe it was an act of euthanasia, that's fair game. But the fact is that because they answered the question the way they did, they have to assume it was. Okay? 17.9% gave the reason that reporting was too much of an administrative burden. 11.9% thought that legal due requirement had possibly not been met. That's why they didn't report. 9% thought that euthanasia is just a private matter. We don't report. 2.3% thought the case that there would be possible legal consequences. That's why they didn't report. Once again, there was a significant relation between reporting of euthanasia and the patient's age, with deaths of patients aged 80 years or older reporting significantly less than other than deaths of younger patients. So it's sort of the same demographic group. What is also important is to show that the law was followed 73.1% of the time, meaning the statute was properly followed 73.1% of the time when the death was reported. When the death was not reported, the law was only properly followed 12.3% of the time. So when you say that when euthanasia is reported, that in fact usually the law is followed, that is somewhat correct. And then this study pointed out that the same association was found in the Netherlands. The association, that is, if a doctor never intended to report the case, in fact, they didn't bother following the law because they never intended to report the case. So in fact, they never consulted another colleague, which is a requirement of the law, when they did not intend to report the case. And then they said, legislation alone does not seem sufficient to reach the goal of transparency. Total or 100% transparency seems to be a rather utopian ideal. Now, why am I pointing out this other study? Because the Netherlands study, which came out in 2010, shows, once again, 23% of the assisted deaths, euthanasia deaths in the Netherlands went unreported in 2010. I think that's significant. Further to that, there was all the news reports coming out saying that, in fact, the levels of euthanasia, the numbers of euthanasia have remained somewhat stable since legalization. But in fact, if you look at the stats, it shows the exact opposite. That in 2006, there was 1,923 reported deaths, and in 2011, there was 3,695. And of course, those stats do not include the unreported deaths. So I think that when you examine this, when you look at what the Royal Society of Canada said, and studies, you have to actually say that the practice of euthanasia and the role of nurses and the reporting of euthanasia in Belgium, one must conclude that not all is well in Belgium. Further to that, the issue of depression is significant. I look at this Vanderlee study. I don't know, I'm almost done for time, I understand. Vanderlee study is important because Dr. Vanderlee is a pro-euthanasia oncologist. She set up this study saying that there is no connection between depression and euthanasia. And in fact, what did she find? She found that there was a 4 times greater risk of request for euthanasia when patients had a depressed mood. And I find that extremely significant because we're talking about protecting people, and we're talking about a depressed mood, 4 times greater risk. We're not talking about a 4% greater risk or a 40% greater risk. We're talking about a 4 times. It means a 400% greater risk to request euthanasia. And the conclusion is depression is a primary risk factor for request for euthanasia. This is suicide. So I think we have to look at this further, and we have to, when we see this further, we say that things are not all well. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go to this conclusion here. When a euthanasia death is not reported or done without request or done by nurses, the patient is usually over the age of 80, dies in a hospital, is often incompetent to request the act. This demographic group fits the description of a vulnerable patient group. We can look at, but I think I ran out of time. I could look at other cases, but we'll do that in another 5 minutes, I think. Thank you.